Donald Trump's imposition of a 25% tariff on Canadian imports faced delays, yet tensions remain high as Canada swiftly retaliated to protect its economy. Provinces, led by British Columbia, launched a proactive countermeasure rather than passively waiting for Ottawa's response. Premier David Eby declared a resolute stance, vowing not to tolerate economic harm, especially targeting vital U.S.-Alaska trade routes. This included imposing tolls on American commercial trucks using BC highways, disrupting over $720 million in annual goods transport. Further measures were implemented, such as a ban on liquor imports from key U.S. states like California, Texas, and Florida, intensifying the economic standoff. These states were targeted because they are home to some of the largest wine and spirits producers, making the ban a strategic move to pressure the U.S. economically. The message was clear. If American politicians chose to challenge Canada with tariffs, their own industries would bear the consequences. The federal government quickly followed suit, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau taking a firm stance. Canadians are reasonable and polite, but we will not back down from a fight when our country and its people are at stake. This wasn't just rhetoric. Canada retaliated by imposing its own 25% tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. The sweeping measures affected aluminum, steel, consumer products, and a significant portion of agricultural exports, delivering a major blow to American producers reliant on the Canadian market. Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc emphasized that Canada had no desire for a trade war, but would not hesitate to respond if the U.S. imposed tariffs. The message was clear. Canada would not be intimidated, and this was just the beginning. Other provinces quickly followed British Columbia's lead. Nova Scotia took a different approach, barring U.S. firms from bidding on government contracts, a significant economic hit. They went even further by doubling road tolls for American commercial trucks entering the province, ensuring that U.S. businesses felt financial pressure at every turn. Alberta's Premier, Danielle Smith, was equally resolute, warning that the Trump administration's actions were forcing Canada into a difficult position. She cautioned that if the situation escalated, both nations would face serious repercussions. Her comments hinted that Alberta's vital oil and gas sector could soon be drawn into the dispute. Given the province's vast energy resources and its crucial role in supplying the U.S., any disruption in exports could have severe consequences for American energy security. A disruption in Alberta's energy exports wouldn't just impact businesses. It could send shockwaves through the entire North American energy market. Meanwhile, Manitoba and Newfoundland also took action, opting for a more symbolic but still impactful approach. Both provinces imposed a complete ban on U.S. liquor imports, but their efforts didn't stop there. They began reviewing trade contracts with American suppliers, seeking opportunities to cut ties and reduce reliance on U.S. goods. The response wasn't limited to government actions. Businesses and consumers across Canada also took a stand. Canadian companies started shifting supply chains away from American manufacturers, while everyday consumers participated in boycotts of U.S. products. This grassroots economic response added even more pressure on the U.S., demonstrating that the standoff extended far beyond just tariffs and official policies. Canada was actively reshaping its trade strategy, accelerating a shift away from reliance on the U.S. Under the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the country had already been expanding exports to Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asia. Now, with the U.S. proving to be an unpredictable trade partner, that transition was moving even faster. Trade Minister Mary Young made Canada's new direction clear. Asterisk, we are building a trade ecosystem that is less dependent on the U.S. Asterisk, but Asia wasn't the only focus. Canada was also strengthening its ties with Europe through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. With the American market becoming increasingly unstable, Canada took advantage of tariff-free trade opportunities in Europe, ensuring its economy remained resilient amid rising tensions with its southern neighbor. The government wasn't merely hoping businesses would adapt, they were actively supporting the transition. Financial incentives were introduced to help Canadian companies expand beyond the U.S. market, reinforcing the message that Canada was preparing for a future where it wouldn't have to depend on America for trade. This wasn't the first time tensions had flared between the two nations. Canada had seen this playbook before. In 1982, the softwood lumber dispute began when the U.S. accused Canada of unfairly subsidizing its timber industry. That conflict dragged on for decades, leading to legal battles at the World Trade Organization, WTO, and repeated trade disputes. More recently, in 2018, the Trump administration had already tested Canada's patience, setting the stage for the current standoff. Tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel triggered a strong response from Canada, which retaliated by targeting politically sensitive U.S. exports, especially agricultural goods from key swing states. The objective was clear: to pressure American lawmakers into reconsidering their stance. However, this time felt different. This wasn't just about counter tariffs. Canada was making a long-term shift, restructuring its trade strategy to reduce its vulnerability to U.S. decisions. For a rude awakening. For decades, the Canadian and American economies have been deeply interconnected, forming the world's largest trading partnership with billions of dollars in daily transactions. But that relationship was now at risk. Canadian leaders recognized that relying on a single, increasingly unpredictable market was no longer sustainable. One of Canada's most significant responses to Trump's tariffs was accelerating its efforts to diversify trade, focusing on expanding partnerships with global markets beyond the U.S. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership had already positioned Canada to access major markets in Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asia. However, with tensions escalating with the U.S., Canada intensified efforts to expand trade under this agreement. Trade Minister Mary Unn made Canada's stance clear. We are building a trade ecosystem that is less dependent on the U.S. This shift wasn't just a reaction. It was a strategic move to secure Canada's economic future, rather than waiting to see how the next U.S. administration would act. But Asia wasn't the only priority. Canada also focused on strengthening its exports to Europe through the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. This deal, signed years earlier, had already granted Canada tariff-free access to European markets. But with trade relations with the U.S. becoming increasingly unstable, businesses saw Europe as a more reliable alternative. The Canadian government wasn't leaving this transition to chance. To accelerate the shift, it introduced financial incentives to help businesses find new buyers and establish stronger trade relationships beyond North America. Companies that had long depended on the U.S. were now being encouraged to seek partnerships in Europe and Asia, reducing their reliance on an increasingly unpredictable trade partner. While Canada was securing its global trade future, it was also holding on to a powerful bargaining tool: energy. The U.S. had long depended on Canada for vital resources, including oil, natural gas, electricity, and uranium. In fact, over 50% of U.S. crude oil imports came from Canada, making it a relationship Washington couldn't afford to overlook. As tensions mounted, Canadian officials quietly began discussing the potential consequences of cutting off this supply, a move that could send shockwaves through the entire North American energy market. The U.S. had structured much of its energy infrastructure around Canadian oil, particularly Alberta's oil sands and the pipelines that transported crude across the border. If Canada chose to redirect its oil and gas exports elsewhere, the U.S. would be left scrambling for alternative sources, ones that wouldn't come cheap. The possibility of limiting energy exports wasn't just an economic threat. It carried significant political weight, forcing Washington to reconsider its stance in the growing trade dispute. The U.S. had previously accused Canada of unfair trade practices, but if Ottawa decided to play the energy card, it could dramatically shift the balance of power. The last major energy standoff the world had seen was when Russia leveraged its gas supply against Europe. Could Canada use a similar strategy against the U.S.? It wasn't just oil and gas at stake. Electricity was also a major factor. Ontario, one of Canada's largest provinces, was already considering halting power exports to U.S. states like Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. If that happened, over 1.5 million Americans could face widespread blackouts, triggering an unprecedented energy crisis. Unlike oil, which could be sourced from other countries at a high cost, Canadian electricity was far harder to replace. The clean hydroelectric power generated in Quebec and Manitoba was a vital part of the U.S. energy supply. Cutting it off would force American states to rely on dirtier, more expensive alternatives, driving up electricity prices and increasing the risk of power shortages. Washington was beginning to grasp just how much leverage Canada had in this conflict. While Trump had justified his tariffs as a way to reduce American dependence on foreign trade, his policies had backfired. Instead of weakening Canada, they had pushed the country to become more independent and more assertive in defending its interests. The pressure was building, and U.S. lawmakers were starting to panic. America was simply not prepared for a full-scale trade war with its northern neighbor. Every time Canada struck back, It hit the U.S. where it hurt the most. But Canadian officials weren't just focused on retaliation. They were making long-term moves to ensure the country's economy would no longer be dependent on U.S. policies. One of the biggest shifts was Canada's decision to prioritize liquefied natural gas, LNG, exports to Europe. With U.S. tariffs targeting Canadian steel and aluminum, Canada needed a new way to strengthen its industrial sector, and expanding LNG exports was the perfect solution. Europe was already seeking alternatives to Russian gas, and Canada had the resources to step in as a key supplier. If projects like LNG Quebec were revived, Canada could double its LNG exports, positioning itself among the top LNG exporters in the world. This shift wouldn't just bolster the economy. It would solidify Canada's role as a major energy player on the global stage. Of course, there were challenges. Shipping LNG from Canada to Europe was significantly more expensive than importing from the U.S. Transporting LNG across the Atlantic took 13 to 15 days, compared to just 5 to 7 days from American ports, leading to higher costs that European consumers would have to absorb. But for many European governments, the trade-off was worth it. Russia's energy dominance had proven to be a geopolitical risk, and Canada was seen as a far more stable and trustworthy partner. As Foreign Minister Melanie Joly put it, exporting LNG from Canada not only helps the EU reduce reliance on Russia, but also creates a sustainable partnership between Canada and Europe. This was a strategic move that would reshape Canada's energy exports and further reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. The shifts were happening fast. Canada was no longer an economy tethered to U.S. trade policies, but a nation actively redefining its economic future. While Trump's tariffs had caused short-term pain, the long-term consequences for the U.S. could be far worse. A new movement was taking hold across Canada. Social media exploded with calls to boycott American products, with the hashtag #BoycottUSA going viral. Canadians shared photos of shopping carts filled with local alternatives, and some stores even began labeling Canadian-made products with small national flags, making it easier for consumers to avoid American brands. What started as an online trend quickly translated into real economic impact. Canadians were also canceling trips to the U.S., a shift that was immediately felt by American tourism hotspots. Normally, millions of Canadians cross the border each year for vacations, shopping trips, or weekend getaways, but that was changing fast. Airlines like WestJet saw noticeable declines in bookings to U.S. destinations, signaling that Canada's economic backlash wasn't just about trade policies. It was becoming a national movement. The fallout from Canada's economic shift was becoming impossible to ignore. One of Canada's largest airlines reported a 25% drop in bookings for flights to the U.S., a sharp decline that quickly rippled through American airports, hotels, and businesses. The numbers were staggering. An estimated $2.1 billion loss to the U.S. tourism industry, hitting key sectors like hospitality, retail, and restaurants particularly hard. But the impact wasn't just limited to tourism. U.S. retailers that depended on Canadian customers were feeling the squeeze. Shopping malls in border towns like Buffalo and Seattle, which had long thrived on the steady influx of Ontario and British Columbia shoppers, suddenly saw empty parking lots where they were once filled with Canadian license plates. Sales plummeted as Canadians consciously redirected their spending toward domestic or international alternatives. This wasn't just a temporary slump, it was a domino effect. Fewer Canadian visitors meant fewer dollars spent in American stores, which led to declining revenues, layoffs, and mounting pressure on local economies. Within months, an estimated 14,000 U.S. jobs have been lost directly due to Canada's economic backlash. At first, many U.S. lawmakers dismissed Canada's response, assuming that any retaliation would have minimal impact. But as the complaints flooded in from struggling businesses, they were forced to take notice. Some politicians tried to downplay the damage, insisting that the U.S. economy could absorb the losses, but not everyone was convinced. Governors from Michigan, New York, and Minnesota, states deeply reliant on Canadian trade and tourism, began raising alarms. They warned that the tariffs were backfiring, causing real economic pain and threatening thousands of jobs in their states. Their message was clear. It was time to reassess the trade war with Canada before the damage became irreversible. As reality set in, it became clear that Canada, one of the United States' largest trading partners, was deeply missed across multiple industries. Although the Trump administration initially justified the tariffs as a way to bolster the American economy. Emerging data suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, in Canada, the response went beyond economics. It was personal. The ease with which the U.S. imposed harsh tariffs on its closest ally struck a nerve, turning the issue into one of sovereignty rather than just business. Trump's remark about Canada potentially becoming the 51st state only intensified frustrations. What may have been intended as a provocative comment was taken as an insult, prompting a strong nationalistic response. Canadians, from politicians to business owners and ordinary citizens, reaffirmed their country's independence. Flags became more visible, and pride in Canadian-made products soared. Campaigns, such as Canada is not for sale, gained traction, reinforcing the nation's strength and self-sufficiency. This surge of nationalism wasn't just symbolic, it influenced policy. While U.S. politicians debated the long-term effects of the tariffs, Canada took concrete steps to ensure its economic resilience. Beyond strengthening trade ties with Europe and Asia, the country ramped up investments in domestic manufacturing. More government contracts were awarded to Canadian suppliers, securing jobs and production within its borders. The transition was gradual, but Canada's long-term objective was clear: reducing its economic reliance on the United States. Energy remained one of Canada's most powerful bargaining tools, and the possibility of cutting off oil, gas, and electricity exports to the U.S. was still under consideration. This uncertainty made American energy companies increasingly uneasy. Ontario's warning that it might stop electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota was especially concerning. If implemented, over 1.5 million Americans could face power outages, making the threat of an energy crisis more tangible. U.S. officials were beginning to recognize just how much influence Canada wielded in this sector. In response, some American energy companies explored alternative sources, but reducing dependence on Canadian energy was far from simple. Canadian oil was deeply embedded in the U.S. supply chain, and many refineries were specifically designed to process it. Finding replacements wasn't just costly, it was nearly impossible in the short term. Meanwhile, Canadian political leaders pushed for new trade deals to strengthen economic ties with Europe and Asia. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, was proving invaluable, allowing Canada to expand exports to Japan, Australia, and Southeast Asia, securing alternative markets for its goods. Similarly, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, with Europe was gaining renewed importance, enabling Canada to leverage tariff-free trade with the EU to establish long-term partnerships and reduce dependence on the U.S. market. The message was clear: the U.S. was no longer Canada's only major trading partner. With government incentives helping companies shift their exports, major corporations sought to expand their presence in European and Asian markets. This strategic move was a direct response to what many viewed as an increasingly unstable and unpredictable trade relationship with the U.S. However, Trump showed no signs of backing down. His administration refused to make concessions, making it clear that Canada's attempts to pressure the U.S. into reversing course would be futile. Instead, he escalated the situation by reinstating a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican steel and aluminum imports. The decision sent shockwaves through the North American economy, forcing Canadian industries to prepare for yet another financial blow. But rather than retreat, Canada saw an opportunity to make a bold move, one that could shift the balance of economic power in North America. Instead of responding with more tariffs, Canada turned its focus to one of its most valuable economic assets: energy. For years, Canada had been a crucial supplier of oil, natural gas, and electricity to the U.S., with American industries heavily dependent on these resources. Canadian energy exports had long been taken for granted, but now Ottawa was considering a once unthinkable strategy: cutting off or significantly restricting energy exports to the U.S. Ontario, one of Canada's most energy-rich provinces, announced that it was exploring the possibility of halting electricity exports to the U.S. If implemented, states like Michigan, Minnesota, and New York would be hit hard, with over 1.5 million Americans at risk of power outages. Blackouts, price surges, and an energy crisis could unfold, affecting hospitals, businesses, and everyday citizens almost immediately. And that was just the beginning. Alberta, home to Canada's vast oil sands, had already started redirecting its oil exports to new international markets, further signaling a major shift in Canada's economic strategy. Canada had long been the largest foreign supplier of oil to the U.S., but rising tensions fueled interest in redirecting those resources to European and Asian markets. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline allowed Canada to boost oil exports to Asia, reducing its dependence on American refineries. Meanwhile, liquefied natural gas, LNG, was becoming a crucial factor. With the European Union eager to lessen its reliance on Russian gas, Canada saw an opportunity. Although shipping LNG from Canada to Europe was costlier than sourcing it from the U.S., the long-term stability of such a partnership made it worthwhile. If Canada could establish itself as a key LNG supplier to Europe, it would further weaken economic ties to the U.S. while strengthening its global influence. For the U.S., this potential energy shift was more than just an economic concern. It was a political nightmare. American industries that depended on affordable Canadian resources now faced rising costs and potential shortages. Oil refineries, auto manufacturers, and steel plants, all built with Canadian imports in mind, suddenly realized that securing those resources in the future might not be as simple. The Trump administration had underestimated just how far Canada was willing to go to protect its economy. What started as a trade dispute was rapidly evolving into a full-scale economic realignment. As the pressure mounted, U.S. lawmakers from affected states pushed back against the White House, urging Trump to reconsider the tariffs before the damage became irreversible. However, it wasn't just politicians feeling the strain. Ordinary Americans began experiencing the impact of the trade war firsthand. Higher prices on imports disrupted supply chains, and economic uncertainty led to growing frustration. Many questioned whether Trump's aggressive trade policies were truly benefiting American businesses or simply making matters worse. Despite mounting opposition, Trump refused to back down, insisting that tariffs were necessary to protect American industries, even as evidence suggested they were doing more harm than good. The loss of Canadian trade was costing the U.S. billions, forcing businesses to either absorb the financial burden or pass it on to consumers. Meanwhile, in Canada, the trade war had ignited a wave of economic nationalism. Consumers actively chose Canadian-made products. Businesses prioritized domestic suppliers,